Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of the Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And here we go, a study of the feast days. As I told you yesterday, a study of the feast days really almost in one way almost should be a lifetime study. I am embarrassed to say that I knew nothing about the feast days until approximately 20 years ago. I think it's been that long. Two things happened. Now, mind you, all right, a little bit of backstory here. When I was a young man in high school, my father was training me to be a salesman. We had a family egg business. At one time, it was the largest egg wholesale business in 4 states, but he was training me. One of my sales routes took me through Pea Ridge, Arkansas. And there is a Seventh-day Adventist community there. The store is owned, the main store in the community was owned by an elder of the congregation there. I was there twice a week. And this elder from this Seventh-day Adventist community, he and I would talk scripture almost every time I was in there. Our discussions mostly centered on, guess what? The Sabbath. That was a tremendous challenge to me. I mean, here I am, 16, 17 years old. Now, mind you, my dad had really trained me to know scripture. But this elder from this congregation presented some challenges to me in regard to the Sabbath day that were really quite challenging. So I'd go home, I'd share with my dad would share with me, et cetera, et cetera. I'd go back to the elder. And I must say this, okay, this is not a brag, it's just a fact. It finally came down to the point that the elder got frustrated and flustered because he could not answer the things that I was sharing. Not because of my own tremendous knowledge, but because my father was helping me and my father was a good student. But that initial exposure to the Seventh-day Adventists, to the Sabbatarian view, was one that piqued my curiosity, caused me to begin to investigate the Sabbath all the way back then. And like I said, I was 16, 17 years old. Wasn't very old. But as a young man, I was always intrigued by theological discussions. My father and I would go to religious debates, and I would read debate books and what have you. So this particular subject is not, that is the question of the Sabbath specifically, is not a subject about which I know nothing. I'm not bragging. I'm just simply saying I've had a lot of exposure to it. But when we go to the broader subject of the feast days, I had been a minister for several years. I encountered a man by the name of Bill Cannongeiser. Bill Cannongeiser was a walking, talking encyclopedia of Israel's feast days. Now, mind you, I had never, ever, ever, ever been encouraged in my fellowship of the amillennial world. I had never been encouraged to study, to investigate the feast days. In the amillennial world in which I was raised in the churches of Christ, any discussion of the feast days started with Passover, ended with Pentecost, with no discussion of the Feast of Unleavened Bread or the Feast of Weeks thrown in. No. Passover, Pentecost, that was it. Because after all, Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Christ is our Passover. Okay, so we got to talk about that at least a little bit. And he instituted the Lord's Supper during the Passover observances. So we got to talk about it. And we've got to talk about Pentecost because it was on the day of Pentecost that the church was established. Boy, this is important, so we got to talk about it. But once again, all discussion, all research, all study concerning the feast days ended at Pentecost and, paradoxically enough, at the cross, because in that fellowship it was and still is taught God nailed the old covenant. God nailed the law of Moses to the cross. That includes Leviticus 23, which we read yesterday. So why discuss the feast days after the day of Pentecost? Now, of course, that's contradictory. Here you are teaching God nailed the law to the cross, and on the other hand, you're affirming the fulfillment of the typology of feast days well after the cross. Something wrong there. So Bill Cannon-Geiser, who lived, I think it was in New Jersey, unfortunately Bill passed away some years ago. For some reason, Bill had sort of kind of chosen me to begin to impart some of his vast knowledge of the feast days. And I'm taking the time to give you my background, okay? It's important for me to share this with you. So I hope you'll be patient with me on this. Many, many times, I simply did not understand what Bill was saying. And I know he got a little bit frustrated with me. But I'll also be very honest about it. It just wasn't ringing my bell. It wasn't getting me excited. He tried and he tried and he tried and he tried. And boy, he shared some really interesting stuff with me. And I was like, okay, thanks, Bill, bye. Dummy. Then, in Sparta, North Carolina, some years later, David Curtis, who is with the Berean Bible Church in Virginia Beach, Virginia, gave a lesson entitled The Feast Days and Eschatology. My wife was with me at that lectureship. I spoke there. David gave what I would now consider almost a thumbnail sketch of the interrelationship, the interconnectedness between Israel's feast days and eschatology. I have to tell you, folks, I sat there literally stunned, totally 100% engrossed, totally fascinated. I had never seen the connection between the feast days and eschatology when Bill Cannon-Geiser was trying to pound it into my head. Like I said, so often it would be, okay, thanks, Bill. Thanks for calling. Good stuff, yeah. It didn't resonate. But when David shared with me the interconnectedness between the feast days and eschatology, drawing out the parallels, drawing out the type and the antitype, it blew me away. I literally turned to my wife and I said, why have I lived for over 50 years and been so incredibly ignorant? And she was blown away too. Beginning at that time, that lecture by David Curtis, I have embarked on a study of the feast days that has and continues to be one of the most exciting journeys of my life. I still feel like there's an awful lot missing in my understanding. But you don't really know what you don't know. And so, as I study and I learn new things about the feast days and eschatology, it's just exciting. Now, in regard to the feast days, I well understand there are many in the Sabbatarian community that don't really like to refer to the Sabbath as a feast day. Why? Well, because normally in most discussions of the Sabbath, it comes down to, among other important passages, Colossians chapter 2, where Paul says, 14 and following, "Let no man judge you in respect of new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, which are a shadow of the good things that are about to come. But the body is Christ." And so the non-Sabbatarian makes the argument and says, Paul, writing in approximately 62 AD, says, "Do not let anyone judge you in response or in regard to the Sabbaths." And my Sabbatarian friends, yes, I have friends who are Sabbatarians. My Sabbatarian friends say, "But you don't understand. You had the ceremonial feast days, which were Sabbaths, but the seventh-day Sabbath was not a ceremonial day. Therefore, all of the ceremonial feast days have been taken out of the way. They were nailed to the cross. But the seventh day is not a ceremonial Sabbath. Therefore, it remains valid and binding today." Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to make one observation at this point. When it is argued, and in this book that I'm working on, Celebrating the Eighth Day, I point this out. When it is argued, oh yes, indeed, the ceremonial feast days were nailed to the cross. We're no longer under the feast days. We're no longer under the animal sacrifices. We're no longer under the old covenant system because God took it out of the way at the cross. Wait a minute. That is exactly the opposite of what Colossians 2 says. Listen to me very carefully. If you're going to say, well, that's, the Sabbaths in Colossians 2, 16, 17, those were the ceremonial Sabbaths. Point number one, you're misunderstanding what it was that was nailed to the cross. When Paul says that the handwriting of ordinances, which was against us, which contrary to us, was nailed to the cross, the handwriting of ordinances there is not a reference to the law itself. It's from the Greek word chirograpphon, and it is literally the handwriting of debt incurred through violation of the law. In other words, it's a different way of Paul saying, through the cross we are forgiven of our sin. It has nothing to do with the passing of the law itself. That's point number one. And I'll be repeating this many, many, many times in this series on the feast days. But the second point is this. Paul emphatically affirms that the new moons, that's Rosh Hashanah. That's some of those, quote, ceremonial feast days that my Sabbatarian friends say, oh, see, we're not under Rosh Hashanah. Guess what? There are even some who call themselves preterists, yet who are Sabbatarians. They don't believe we have to observe Rosh Hashanah. Now, by the way, running out of time here, there is a rapidly growing group of people called the Torah observant group who insist that we must today, to be followers of Christ, we must observe the law of Moses. We must be Torah observant. I've been encouraged lately several times to look up the YouTube videos by a man by the name of Sean, who is evidently very, very popular on YouTube, and have a debate with him on the continuing validity of the law of Moses, the continuing observance of Torah. Well, I'm currently involved in preparation for a major debate coming up in March with Chris Date. By the way, the date, no pun intended, has been shifted from March the 2nd to later in the month. I'll announce the specific dates as soon as I can. So anyway, when that debate is over, I will be more than happy to look into what Mr. Sean is saying and investigate the possibility of a debate with him on the issue of Torah observance for Christians today. So you might be looking forward to that. You might drop him a line and say, what about this? What about a debate with Mr. Preston? Okay. So, so some of our predators tell us, okay, yes, the ceremonial laws have been taken out of the way. We are not bound to keep the ceremonial laws, but the Sabbath is a distinctive feast. They don't like to call it a feast. But I want you to notice what Paul actually says. Let no man judge you in respect of new moons, feast days. Was the seventh day Sabbath a feast day, ladies and gentlemen? Ask yourself the question, was it a feast day? Well, it's the very first feast day listed in Leviticus chapter 23. There is no justification whatsoever for denying that the Sabbath is not included in the, quote, ceremonial feast days. Paul makes no distinction whatsoever between, a Sabbath, which is not a feast day, or the Sabbath, which is not a feast day, and the other Sabbaths, which were feast days. They are all feast days. And Paul said, don't let anybody judge you in respect to a new moon feast day or Sabbaths. Now, a Sabbatarian friend say, well, that's a distinctive form of the word. Well, every single one of the Sabbaths or the feast days in Leviticus chapter 23, did you notice it as we read through it? On this day you will do no work. No distinction between the feast days in this regard. You will do no normal labor on this day. So in regard to labor on the feast days, which includes the Sabbath, seventh day Sabbath, no distinction. But watch what Paul says. He says those new moons, ceremonial feast days, we're told. Sabbaths, which is an all-inclusive term, and Sabbaths are, that is in the present tense, ladies and gentlemen, for when Paul wrote. They are a shadow of the things that, good things that are about to come. So Paul is affirming that when he wrote in AD 62, the last three especially of Israel's feast days, the last three especially of Israel's feast days were still abiding, remaining, unfulfilled shadows of the good things. Now, I didn't just say a few of the good things that will one day by and by come. They were, when he wrote, about to come. That means that whatever the Sabbaths foreshadowed, it was about to be fulfilled. It means that the feast days, inclusive of the seventh day Sabbath, as a feast day, it foreshadowed something. And whatever it typified and foreshadowed, that was about to come. Not 2,000 years later, it was about to come. Do you catch the power of the fact that Paul said the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths had not been nailed to the cross? They were, when he wrote in 62 AD, still shadows of the good things that were about to come. I have a whole lot more to say on this, and we'll see some of it on the flip side. See you there.